Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar on NHMRC's new grant program. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the many lands on which we're meeting today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are with us in this webinar today. Now, this webinar is intended to bring you up to date on a whole lot of details of the new grant program which we've been developing over the last few months. I hope it's going to answer at least some of your questions, but we'll follow up with the FAQs and also later in the year with more details on other aspects that won't be covered today as they're settled. So the restructured grant program will provide a new framework for NHMRC's $800 million investment in Australian health and medical research for funding starting from the 1st of January 2020. As you'll know, it's been developed with the advice of a fantastic expert advisory group made up of people from across the research sector in Australia, and also followed extensive consultation with the sector last year and early this year. Our council and principal committees, and especially research committee, have also played critical roles in advising us on the development of this new grant program. So that work culminated with the announcement of the new grant program by the Minister for Health, Greg Hunt, on the 25th of May this year. And the Minister noted that these were changes which the research community had itself proposed and agreed upon, and which he, as Minister, has accepted in full and unchanged. So we do appreciate the Minister's support for this major reform. Now, I now want to recap on the structure of the new grant program, and this will be familiar to many people by now. And I also want to comment on how this structure is going to address the objectives of the reform. First of all, we're going to have investigator grants to support the research program of outstanding investigators at all career stages, synergy grants to support outstanding multidisciplinary teams to work together on major questions, ideas grants to support focused, innovative research projects on a specific question, and then a range of schemes that we've collected together under the heading of strategic and leveraging grants, which is to support research that addresses identified national needs. Now, the objectives of this reform were threefold. First of all, to encourage innovation and creativity across all fields of health and medical research. Secondly, to provide opportunities for talented researchers at all career stages and across all disciplines relevant to health and medical research. And thirdly, to minimise the burden on researchers of excessive writing of applications and peer review to free up more time for research, while remembering that our core focus at NHMRC is to improve human health and well-being through research. So let me run through how I think the new grant program is going to support these three objectives. First of all, for encouraging innovation and creativity, both the investigator grants and the synergy grants offer a lot of flexibility to the investigators for strategic, creative, collaborative research. And the ideas grants specifically focus on fresh thinking and on the science and the innovation and the creativity, rather than the track record of the investigators. The second objective of providing opportunities for talented researchers will be supported by the investigator grants, which will be provided at all career stages, from immediate postdoc through to the most senior researchers. Synergy grants will encourage diverse teams, more diverse than our current program grants, for example, taking into account discipline, career stage, and gender. And ideas grants will be an opportunity for people at any stage of their career with less developed track records. And then the third objective of minimising burden on researchers will be achieved by the consolidation of funding in the investigator grants, with the person receiving a salary if required and a research support package, therefore reducing their need to apply for multiple project grants year in, year out. And then the combination of consolidation plus capping of grants numbers of grants is expected over time to reduce the application numbers once we reach a steady state. But I do think that we can't expect to see a big reduction in application numbers in the first year or so as we transition into the new grant program, but it's been designed to achieve that reduction over time. Now, the information that's going to be provided in this presentation covers quite a number of topics. First of all, for investigator grants, I'm going to go over the structure of this scheme, the salaries and the sizes of the research support packages, part-time and non-salaried grants, and investigator grants and relevance for working overseas. For synergy and ideas grants, I'm going to talk very briefly about eligibility and budgets. And then I'm going to talk in some detail about transitional arrangements with the final rounds of the program and project grants, and then the quite complex situation of the transition from old to new schemes. So this slide will be familiar to people from the launch some time ago. I want now to focus on investigator grants. These are 5-year grants given to outstanding individuals and will provide a salary if required and a research support package, and I'll go into those details shortly. So one of the important changes we're making is a substantial streamlining of our current scheme, and you'll know that over time the NHMRC Fellowship scheme has become quite complex with many different levels and different types of fellowships for different purposes. So a major outcome of this restructure is the streamlining into just 5 levels, from the early career, immediately post-PhD level of emerging leadership level 1, up to the most senior principal research fellowship level of leadership level 3. And you'll see on this slide how each of our current fellowship levels aligns with the new levels in the investigator grant scheme. We won't be talking about postgraduate scholarships today because there are no changes currently planned for that scheme, but they are a component of this investigator grants scheme. So now the scheme structure and showing the salaries that correspond to each level of emerging leadership and leadership level investigator grants. And as I showed on the previous slide, these levels align with existing fellowships, and we've selected the highest salary level for each of those groups in determining the salaries at the levels of the emerging leadership and leadership schemes. For emerging leadership, these are for people who are less than or up to 10 years post-PhD or equivalent, and that means for EL1 up to 5 years normally, and EL2 normally up to 5 to 10 years. And the individual will self-select these levels according to their career stage. For the leadership levels, L1, 2 and 3, again, it will be for the applicant to select which leadership level to apply for, but NHMRC will be providing guidance on the expectations for each of those leadership levels. The salaries are shown per annum. They'll increase in line with indexation, and they're shown as one full-time equivalent. So, of course, if somebody was a half-time fellow, then they would have half that salary. Now, there's another very important change that we've made that's shown on this slide. At the moment in our fellowship scheme, people can keep on applying without a total cap on the number of times they can hold an NHMRC fellowship. In this case, we're introducing an ultimate cap on the number of terms that somebody can hold an investigator grant. And you'll see for the emerging leadership levels that these levels can each be held once, in each case a 5-year term. Once people move into the leadership level, 1, 2 and 3, they can hold a maximum of 5 terms in total, but those can be in different combinations. For example, they can hold an L1 level for up to 2 times, they can hold L2 up to 2 times, and L3 up to 5 times. But if, for example, they'd held L1 twice, L2 once, then they could only hold L3 another 2 times to reach a maximum of 5. So it's very important to note that that new limit on the number of terms that people can hold an investigator grant will not be applied retrospectively. In other words, no consideration will be taken of how long somebody has already been in the existing NHMRC Fellowship scheme. So the clock starts ticking on the 1st of January 2020. The other thing to note here is that this will allow somebody to have up to 35 years in total of NHMRC investigator grant support, or 25 years at the leadership level. So now I want to turn to a slide that I know many people will have been asking about, and that is the research support packages. And so these are not strictly aligned with the salary levels, which I showed on the previous slide. And so let me explain that. For the emerging leadership levels, there will be 2 research support packages offered, and these will be automatically allocated according to the emerging leadership level. So the immediately postdoc EL1 fellow will receive a fixed $50,000 per annum package, and the next level, the EL2, will receive a $200,000 per annum fixed package. When we move into the leadership levels, L1 to L3, there are 4 levels of package that may be awarded, between $300,000 and $600,000 per annum. Now, the allocation of the package to the person will be determined on the overall score achieved through peer review. And a really important feature of this is that these packages won't be aligned automatically with seniority. So in principle, it will be possible, for example, for a level 1 leadership investigator grantee to receive the highest research support package of $600,000 per annum, and for the most senior person at L3 level, the highest level equivalent to senior principal research fellow, to receive a lower package. So that's a very important feature of this new scheme. Now, these numbers have been guided in part by our analysis of what fellows currently receive from project grants and program grants in our current scheme. And we just draw to your attention the fact that the average project grant size at the moment is about $600,000 per annum if we exclude the very large clinical trials grants. And that would typically be over a 3-year grant, so it'd be $200,000 per annum over a 3-year grant. So now for the leadership levels, people will receive something between $300,000 and $600,000 per annum over a 5-year grant. Another very important point that I'll come back to later is that it's possible for somebody who holds an ideas grant to apply for an investigator grant, and we want to certainly to allow that to happen so that people can move over into the investigator grants system. But if they already have an ideas grant at that stage, then their research support package will be reduced by 50% for each ideas grant held. So that if they currently hold 2 ideas grants at the time they're awarded an investigator grant, they will have they won't receive a research support package until those ideas grants have expired. If one expires before the other, then they'll move up to a 50% research support package and then back to 100% of the package which was awarded at peer review. So just to make it really clear by putting some of this all onto one slide, the alignment of levels of salary is not strictly connected to the levels of research support package. The research support packages for EL1 and EL2 are awarded based on seniority and emerging leadership, and then the RSPs, the research support packages for the level 1, 2 and 3 leadership investigator grants are awarded based on the score in a like-for-like assessment with other candidates who are like, rather than seniority. So in the steady state, when we've fully moved to the new grant program, this will be the eligibility for people as they move through this investigator grant scheme. If they have never held an investigator grant before, then they'll be eligible for all levels, EL1 through to L3, subject to their number of years postdocs, because clearly EL1 and EL2 are for people who are up to 10 years post-PhD or equivalent. And as people move through the scheme, then they'll have eligibility to apply again at the same level or at a higher level, subject to the caps on total numbers of terms at each level, which I've described on an earlier slide. So I hope that slide will be useful when you're working out your own position in this scheme. I'll come back to the transition, excuse me, from fellowships to investigator grants shortly. So now I want to talk about a couple of other aspects of these investigator grants. The first is part-time investigator grant. Now these are aimed to cater for people who have caring or professional commitments, such as clinical commitments, that mean that they can't apply 100% of their time to research. In this case, the applicants can select their percentage of salary in the range 0 to 90% in 10% increments. If they go for, let's say, a 50% salary, they're not obliged to go for a 50% research support package. We realise there are circumstances, and this might include people who have caring responsibilities for a few years and wish to go part-time on their salary, but nevertheless are able to sustain supervision of a research group, that they may be appropriate to receive 100% research support package even if their salary is less than 100%. But regardless of the percentage of salary or research support package, this is a 5-year application and award, and both stages will finish on the same date after 5 years, rather than being extended to accommodate the part-time salary. So the second point I want to talk about is investigator grants where no salary is requested. And so the idea here is to support research of outstanding investigators who don't actually need a salary from NHMRC. And this could be somebody who already has an academic appointment in a university or a clinical appointment in a hospital, or it might be a director of an independent medical research institute, or it could be somebody who has a non-NHMRC fellowship, but is nevertheless an outstanding investigator, and it would be appropriate for them to receive a research support package rather than to be applying for other grant schemes. In this case, the non-salaried investigator grant will be provided with the research support package only. We currently offer early career fellowships which are for to be partly spent overseas, and we're no longer going to do that specifically with specific schemes. What we're going to do instead is enable people who receive an investigator grant in the emerging leadership level to spend up to 50% of their grant time overseas, provided that they spend the final 2 years of the grant back in Australia, and these are 5-year grants. And then at the leadership level, we'd enable people to spend up to 20% of their grant time overseas. And if they are somebody who's received an investigator grant with less than 100% salary, then of course they're welcome to spend all of their non-NHMRC time overseas. And this might be particularly relevant for people who hold joint appointments with overseas research institutions. So now I want to turn to synergy grants, and these will be offered to teams of strong investigators. There may be people who hold investigator grants or ideas grants. There may be people who hold grants from the ARC, for example. And they'll be offered on top of the investigator grants or ideas grants that the chief investigators already hold. And this is an important distinction from our current program grant scheme. I also want to highlight that these are fixed dollar value grants, $5 million per grant. We'll be awarding up to 10 each year from the Medical Research Endowment account in the first instance. And the budget of these grants can be used for personnel support packages and for direct research costs, much like a project grant. And also like a project grant, chief investigator salaries can be paid from that budget up to PSP 5 level, provided, of course, that the person isn't receiving their salary from another NHMRC source, such as an investigator grant. And each chief investigator, at whatever level they are in the list, may apply for and hold one synergy grant. So now to turn to ideas grants briefly. And these are, again, up to 5 years, maybe teams of up to 10 people. These, as for current project grants, the grant size will be based on the requested budget. The budget request will be based on personnel support packages and direct research costs. And again, as for the synergy grants and as for current project grants, chief investigators may request their salary from the ideas grant up to PSP 5 level. And in the new system, chief investigators at whatever level they are, CI8 or CIJ, may apply for and hold up to 2 ideas grants concurrently. And then finally on this table, I'll move to the strategic and leveraging grants. And as you'll know, these include a series of grants which we've had established for quite some time and which we will continue in their current form. And these are listed here: CREs, development grants, our various international collaborative schemes, targeted calls for research, partnership projects and partnership centres. But we'll also be adding a new scheme which is specifically for clinical trials and cohort studies, which are currently funded through the project grants scheme. We've been out for public consultation recently on a new framework for this scheme, and we'll be providing more details following analysis of the submissions to that consultation and further work by the working group that's been advising us on the development of that scheme. So now I want to turn to the complex issue of transition to the new grant program. The goal here is to reach the new steady state while ensuring that we have transparency and equity, minimal disadvantage or selective advantage for any group of researchers or researcher. We also want to achieve something that is simple to understand and to administer, because there's potential for enormous and unmanageable complexity here. So a few important conclusions are, first of all, that we will honour all existing grants. We will try through the transitional arrangements to stage entry to the new schemes where that's possible, to try not to have great peaks and troughs of applications as we move through the first few years of transition. And we're also seeking a model which treats access to the Investigator Grant and Ideas Grant schemes as equitably as we can. The two application, I'm going to just want to remind you with this slide that our purpose is to reach the steady state that's shown here with the capping arrangements between the Investigator, Synergy and Ideas Grants, which were presented at the launch on the 25th of May. So I won't spend any more time on that, but it's available there for you to refer to as needed. But I want to turn first of all to the transition to the new grant program for the next round, which is next year, which is the final round of our existing grant schemes before we fully implement the new grant program. So that means the final project grant round will be in 2018 for funding in 2019, and after that no new project grants will be awarded. And as we previously announced, applicants may submit up to 2 project grant applications in this future round. So we're introducing a cap there that's intended to smooth the transition to the new grant program. But that will still have a total cap for existing project grants of 6, so people can apply for up to 2, but only if they've got capacity in that current cap of 6 grants held. So if they currently hold 4, they can apply for another 2. If they currently hold 5, they can only apply for 1. And this capping applies to all chief investigators on project grants. So it's CIA to CIJ position, not only for CIAs. And again, as we also already announced, there'll be no program grant round in 2018. That's because that round, if it were held, would be for funding in 2020. And that scheme is going to be replaced by the Synergy Grant Scheme, which will open in 2019 for funding in 2020. So there won't, in fact, be a gap between the end of the Program Grant Scheme and the introduction of the Synergy Grant Scheme. So the development of a transition plan from the old to the new grant program has been probably the most challenging exercise so far in the development of the implementation plan here. And working with Research Committee, we've spent a lot of time on this over the last months. I'm particularly grateful to Research Committee for their help with this set of issues. We realise that investigators will hold many different numbers and combinations of fellowship, project and program grants, and these will all be honoured, so they'll be allowed to complete their term, of course. However, the constraints on NHMRC's total research funding budget means that we can't ignore those grants as we move into the new grant program. And so we have to take them into account as we award new grants and grant budgets. And we need here to try to stage the entry to even out the peaks and troughs, as I've said already. So the intention then is that a researcher's portfolio of fellowship, project and program grants held on the 1st of January 2020 will affect their eligibility to apply for Investigator, Synergy and Ideas grants, and it will also affect the percentage of a research support package awarded for an investigator grant, and I'll spell that out shortly. And and in a corresponding manner, it will affect the number of ideas grants for which those investigators can apply. But these effects will cease as the existing grants from the old grant scheme expire, and then people will come up to their full eligibility and full research support packages. So let's talk first about NHMRC Fellows and transitional eligibility. I've already shown eligibility once we're in the new grant scheme and how people will move through EL1 up to L3. But if for current fellows, you'll be wanting to know where you can enter this new system. So of course, if you don't already hold any fellowship or haven't previously held a fellowship, then all levels of the new Investigators Grant Scheme are open to you, subject to years post-PhD, as the EL1 and EL2 levels of the people who are up to 10 years post-PhD or their equivalent. But if you have an early career fellowship already or have already held one, then you'll have eligibility for EL2 as long as you're still under 10 years post-PhD, or for L1, L2, L3. And as you can see, as you go down through this table, eligibility for lower levels slips away, but you'll continue to have eligibility at your own level or the next level, subject to the caps on total total terms at each level, which I described on an earlier slide. Existing NHMRC Fellows can't hold a concurrent investigator grant, but they may, while they hold their fellowship, apply for ideas grants and or a synergy grant, subject to the capping rules that are on an earlier slide. They may apply for an investigator grant in the penultimate year of their fellowship, which would then, if it was successful, commence in the next year, and they'd skip the last year of their NHMRC fellowship. Or they could wait till the final year of their fellowship and apply for an investigator grant and an ideas grant as a fallback, and then if both of those applications are successful, then it's the investigator grant that will be awarded. So we want here to enable existing NHMRC Fellows to see out their fellowship, to have access to the grant schemes, to move over into the investigator grant scheme either after year 4 or year 5 of their existing research fellowship, but in that last year of application have the fallback position of applying for an ideas grant as well as an investigator grant. So turning now to transitional eligibility from program grants into the scheme, new investigator grants, chief investigators on program grants may apply for an investigator grant, but if they're holding their program grant at the time that the investigator grant is to start, then they won't receive the research support package until the program grant expires, because this is based on the assumption that every chief investigator on a program grant is receiving some of the budget of that program grant. Chief investigators on program grants may not hold a concurrent synergy grant or ideas grant, again because they're receiving funding from their program grant. But once they're in the final year of the program grant, they may apply for a synergy grant, and they may also apply for ideas grants in the final year of the program grant if they're subject to the eligibility and capping rules that are on earlier slides. So we want to facilitate people transitioning from a program grant into the new grant program as their program grants expire. Now, the most complex situation is for project grants, and I want to spend a bit of time on this. First of all, in transition, an investigator grant research support package will be reduced by 25% for each project grant held, up to 50% maximum. So in other words, if somebody holds 6 project grants, they'll still get half of their investigator grant research support package. So this is a very gentle reduction in the research support package in this transition phase, recognizing the fact that people didn't know that these new rules would be coming in at the time they acquired their project grants, and also recognizing that many chief investigators don't actually receive any budget or a significant budget from the project grants on which they are CIs. Access to ideas grants using the same principle will be unaffected by one project grant held, but their access to ideas grants will be reduced from 2 to 1 if 2 or more project grants are held. So again, somebody could hold 6 project grants, but they could still apply for 1 ideas grant. So this is a softer transitional capping effect than the one I've already described that we'll reach in the steady state, when an investigator grant research support package will be reduced by 50% for each ideas grant held and can therefore be reduced back to 0. And likewise, in the steady state, access to ideas grants will be reduced 1 for 1 for each ideas grant held. So we've chosen a much softer pathway for the transition from project grants to ideas grants. But as I said before, because of the constraints on budget, we have had to take these existing grants into account. So here are 3 examples. I'm sorry, we've lost something from the middle box, so I'll tell you what that is. First of all, let's look at the left-hand side and ask about a CI who doesn't currently hold a project or a program grant. In this case, they're eligible to apply for an investigator grant and an ideas and to the ideas grant scheme. And if they receive an investigator grant, then they'll receive their full research support package as awarded by the peer review panel, because there's no need to reduce that package because of pre-existing project or program grants. Likewise, if they're successful for ideas grants, they'll be eligible for 2 ideas grants. Now, the box in the middle was meant to say be somebody who's a chief investigator on 1 project grant. And in this case, if they apply to the investigator grant scheme and they're successful, they'll have a 25% reduction of the research support package. If they apply to the ideas grant scheme and are successful, then they will be in fact eligible for 2 ideas grants. So they get to keep their 1 project grant for free, if you like, in that pathway. If the chief investigator is on 2 or more project grants and they're successful in the investigator grant scheme, they'll have a 50% reduction in their awarded research support package. Even if they have 6 project grants, it'll only be a 50% reduction. And if they apply to the ideas grant scheme, they'll still be eligible for 1 ideas grant. And so this attempts to illustrate at least the first 3 simpler pathways into the new grant program, and also to show how, as far as possible, we have tried to treat access to the investigator grant scheme in a symmetrical way with access to the ideas grant scheme. When we provide all of this material in more detail on our website, we'll provide a whole lot of other combinations and show pathways through them that will help people work out their own particular circumstances. So I now just want to say a few words about the next steps for this implementation project, a very large project. The first is that we now need to develop funding rules for all of the new schemes, and we'll be holding targeted consultations with groups in the research sector and peak bodies and research officers over the next months, and we'll also need to seek government approvals for the funding rules. We will now proceed with designing peer review processes for the new investigator ideas and synergy grant schemes. We quite deliberately last year didn't consult on peer review processes because we thought that should wait until we knew the structure of the new grant program. Now we do know the structure. We have most of the overarching frameworks for these grant schemes worked out, and so it's time to consider what peer review processes would support finding the most appropriate grantees. So we're forming a series of expert advisory groups to advise on particular aspects of this. And for example, a track record working group met for the first time last week for very important work on track record assessment. We're going to undertake a public consultation on peer review a little later in the year, put out a consultation paper in September, and hold some town hall meetings, if you like, in key capital cities in October and November. So please watch out for the details of those. And then some targeted consultations in the first part of 2018. Also, while doing this, we have quite a number of further issues to consider and work through on the advice of the research committee, and they include, for example, the role of associate investigators, ensuring strong support and opportunity for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health researchers, and a number of other issues that will perhaps come up in questions, but which are still to be fully worked through and not ready for further discussion today. So just to show you the timeline, this is pretty much the timeline as it was presented at the announcement, but shows now the date today, this webinar in August, the introduction of project grant capping in December this year for the final round of the project grant scheme, new grant program applications opening from late 2018 into 2019, and then new grants commencing in January 2020. So some of the things that will happen between these milestones are, first of all, for funding rules, the drafting of those will commence soon and will require a targeted consultation with a number of groups. We then have to go through a process of revision and submission to the Department of Finance and the Minister for Health to ensure that we can proceed in this way. And then those funding rules will be published as soon as we have those approvals, and with the intention of providing plenty of time for people to absorb them before applications open in late 2018. And then for peer review guidelines, as I've said, we are going to undertake public consultation on peer review over the coming months and targeted consultations in early 2018 for use in peer review of applications for the new grant program during 2019. So information, as always, will be available on our website. This slide set will be available today, and we'll be providing media releases and updates. We'll provide updates in the place shown on our webpage there, updated details of the new grant program accommodating everything that I've described today will be available soon on the website at the address shown there. So I want to thank everybody. I especially want to thank the expert advisory group for the groundwork that they did in providing the framework for this new grant program. I want to highlight the incredible role and hard work of Research Committee over these last months as we've worked through the many details of policies and processes which I've outlined before. We really appreciate their wise advice very much. And finally, I want to thank all of you for your support and patience as we go through this very complex process of implementing the new grant program. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and also. My name is Tony Willis, and I'm leading the task force that Anne has set up to implement the NHMRC's new grant program. I'm going to be asking Anne whether there have been any questions or fielding the questions that have come through to Anne during the webinar. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to remind you that from today's presentation, we're going to have a diagram outlining in slightly more detail than Anne has presented in her webinar today the transitional eligibility arrangements, and these are also going to be put on our website. So turning to the first of the questions, Anne, we've had a number of questions that have come through during your presentation. And the first of these concerns whether or not researchers are able to take their salary from an ideas grant.
Yeah, thank you, Tony, and thanks for that question. It is certainly the case that chief investigators can draw a salary from an ideas grant just as they can now from project grants up to PSP 5 level. And that's also true for synergy grants.
Thank you, Anne. We've also inevitably had several questions relating to the investigator grant program and the details that you've outlined there. I'm going to try and consolidate as many of these questions together into a group under some of the technical arrangements relating to investigator grants that you've outlined. And so the first of those is we've had a question or a series of questions around whether we have any estimates around the numbers of investigator grants that might be awarded, and whether we would be proposing to impose limits at this stage on the numbers awarded in each level.
So first of all, we consider, based on the internal modelling that we've done, that we expect to be able to award a similar number of investigator grants as we currently award fellowships. There are, of course, a lot of uncertainties there because it's affected very much by the number of people who are successful in getting an investigator grant, for example, with a research support package but without a salary, or the number of people who are applying for part-time fellowships. So these sorts of issues which affect the number which can be awarded from an essentially fixed budget will determine the ultimate number which can be awarded through that scheme. But we expect it to be rather similar. In other words, these are not going to be easy to get, but we don't expect them to be a lot harder to get than the current fellowships. As now, we will have the capacity to move to allocate funds to different levels if it looks as if that's the appropriate way to respond to the application burden. We have some flexibility at the moment to do that, and it's always a very important discussion at the beginning of the year with Research Committee about how to allocate the budget between the different schemes and between the different levels of the fellowship program, and we'll continue to have that capacity in the new grant program.
Thanks, Anne. Some more questions again around investigator grants, and this question is really about whether professorial appointment or professorial title will affect your eligibility to apply for any of the levels in the investigator grant program.
No, we're not going to take any account in any kind of eligibility sense for professorial or associate professorial title. That's a constraint which has been progressively removed from our schemes over the last year or so because it became very complex and had unintended consequences, and so we will not consider professorial status in considering eligibility for any of the levels of the leadership, or for that matter emerging leadership levels of the investigator grant scheme.
And another group of questions around eligibility to apply for investigator grants. We've had some questions around whether the age of an applicant would affect their eligibility to apply, particularly given the limits that will be applied to the number of occasions that you can apply to different levels in the new scheme.
Yes, there won't be an age limit.
Again, relating to investigator grants, some people are interested for clarification on the duration of those grants, and are they all for 5 years or?
Yes, they are all for 5 years, so that's a slight change from our current suite of fellowship schemes where the most junior ones are 4 years, but now all of them will be 5-year grants.
And again, continuing with the investigator grant eligibility theme, will any of the eligibility requirements be applied retrospectively as we introduce the new scheme? Will the limits in particular be applied retrospectively, or will the clock start ticking from the opening of that new program?
It varies a bit with scheme because, as I described, previous terms held as an NHMRC Fellow will not have any impact on the number of terms people can receive an investigator grant. So we've, as I've said, we've applied a total of 5 terms for people at the leadership level, L1, 2 and 3, but that won't take into account whether they've already, for example, held an SPRF or research fellowship for 1 or more terms. So we will start the clock ticking at the 1st of January 2020. But of course, the eligibility for other schemes is affected by numbers of project grants, program grants that are currently held, as I described.
And again, continuing with the theme of investigator grants, we've had a question around the proportion of the salary that they might be able to apply for. And specifically, the question, or the group of questions were seeking some clarification around whether you could apply for a relatively small proportion of the salary, perhaps to enable other arrangements, clinical or professional arrangements, to be pursued if you don't need the full salary.
Yes, in fact, we really want to make it simple for people to do just exactly that. Some people may have a 50-50 research clinical position, for example, and could apply for a 50% salary on an investigator grant because they're paid for their clinical work for the other 50%. There'll be many different circumstances for different people around the country, and there's a lot of flexibility for part-time salaries in the new investigator grant scheme.
Getting a few questions through now concerning some of the other schemes, and I'm going to move briefly to those, Anne. And the first of those is around when we would be expecting to open up the Ideas Grant scheme for the first, to receive the first set of applications for it.
Yes, so we'd expect that to open in late 2018 for applications in 2019 for funding to commence on the 1st of January 2020.
And again, perhaps with particular reference to the Ideas Grant scheme and reflecting perhaps on current arrangements with the Project Grant scheme. What are our strategies around trying to ensure that relatively specialist researchers such as bioinformaticians aren't going to be disadvantaged? And in the same vein, are we giving thought to how associate investigators might be managed in the new grant program?
Yes, this is a really important question that came up many times during our public consultation last year and has had some discussion so far internally and with Research Committee, but with a lot more discussion still to be held. It's a really important point because we want to support specialist people like biostatisticians, bioinformaticians, health economists, and there'll be a number of other specialist technical people who are often involved with multiple grants. We want to enable that and encourage it and not in any way reduce those people's ability to build their careers as independent researchers. And so there will be cases where such a person may be competitive for an investigator grant, and so that will certainly be a possibility for some. There will be the option to be a chief investigator on up to 2 Ideas Grants or to join a Synergy grant team. There'll also be the option to be employed as up to PSP5 on an Ideas Grant or a Synergy grant, or indeed through somebody's investigator grant research support package, or to be contracted through direct research costs from any of those grant schemes. But there's more thought and more work to be done on the position of associate investigator, how to take that into account in peer review, and how to place appropriate value on these specialist skills. So we'll be talking more about that internally, discussing it with Research Committee and bringing more back to you later in the year.
And some questions are coming through around allowing people to become eligible for grants under the new grant program, and particularly whether we would allow them to vary off their current grants to become eligible to apply for new grants, and in that context, whether or not our current variations policy will stand.
Our current variations policy will continue, which does not make it easy for somebody simply to say, well, I want to remove myself from this grant so that I can apply for another. So the existing variations policy will continue.
And again, continuing with a bit of a focus on the Ideas Grant scheme and the current Project Grant scheme, some questions around whether we would still be interested in being an agent for other funding bodies, perhaps Cancer Australia, for example, to assist with their funding schemes.
Yes, yes, absolutely. We're very interested in maintaining strong partnerships with other funders, and we've been in detailed discussions with Cancer Australia and the Cancer Councils about how to do this through those partnerships. And we will continue to offer opportunities for partnering through any one of these schemes, as we have in the past. So we're very keen to continue those partnerships. I think it's a very important way of mutually leveraging funds into research and allowing other funding agencies or philanthropic groups to draw on the expert peer review processes of NHMRC.
And again, we're getting some questions coming back around investigator grants. I'll come back to those in just a minute. A little while ago, we got some questions around the continuation of grants among our strategic and leveraging schemes. So, for example, development grants and partnership projects in particular, and what our expectations are for those programs.
Yes, they're both very successful programs, and they also both continue to evolve. So we plan to maintain them both, and they may continue to evolve further, of course, but there are no changes proposed as part of this restructure. And of course, there are no caps on application numbers to grant schemes which are in that fourth column of the table, the strategic and leveraging grants. So at this stage, we're not expecting there to be any direct impact of the new grant program for investigator synergy and ideas grants on those grants schemes in column 4.
And again, some questions around eligibility for investigator grants. Excuse me, moving back to that program. And in particular, whether or not holding, for example, an ARC fellowship would impact on the eligibility of an applicant to the NHMRC investigator scheme.
NHMRC is only concerned that the research it funds has something to do with the improvement of human health. And so there's no bar to an ARC fellow applying for and holding an investigator grant where they would receive the research support package but not receive the salary, of course, because they're already receiving that from another source. And likewise, such fellows could apply to our other schemes as well. And we'd really encourage people thinking about synergy grants to think about multidisciplinary collaborations with people who are funded by non-NHMRC sources, where that's an appropriate and useful way to develop the research for the best outcome.
Thank you, Anne. Some questions now of a slightly more general nature, and I can come back to some of the specifics if they continue to come in. There was a question around whether or not the expert groups have been formed to help provide advice to you on how peer review arrangements might work.
Yes, the expert group for our track record working group has been formed and has had its first meeting, and will meet at least a couple more times this year before providing its advice. And that's a very strong group and off to a vigorous start, naturally. And there are a couple of other advisory groups that are still being formed at the moment, but we hope we'll be able to start work soon.
That's fantastic. We've also, again, at a more general level, had some inquiries around how the new grant program is going to align with the program of the MRFF, and whether NHMRC has been working with the Health Department to administer any of the MRFF schemes.
Yes, NHMRC is working closely with the MRFF team in the Department of Health, and you may know that in the first round of disbursements from the MRFF announced in the May budget, there are 3 schemes which are being administered by NHMRC into clinical trials, for clinical fellowships, and for a targeted call for research on antimicrobial resistance. The clinical trials and clinical fellowship schemes have direct alignment with schemes that are in the new grant program, and so they offer an opportunity for MRFF to continue using NHMRC processes.
Thanks, Anne. Again, a query as we move into our final couple of questions around the investigator grant program. And we've had a question as to whether or not we will be placing a higher preference to applicants in that scheme with a clinical background, or whether there will be equal preference given to all applicants.
We don't specifically intend to favour a particular type of applicant. We want to have a scheme which is open to the best researchers across the full spectrum of health and medical research. So obviously that includes bench scientists, it includes clinicians, it includes public health researchers, it includes allied health professionals undertaking research, a very wide range, and we would want all of those groups to have access to the investigator grant scheme.
And we're drawing rapidly to the close of the time that we have available, so I'm going to ask one final question. We've had this from a number of different sources now, which is essentially how we might provide feedback to you and how we might ask further questions of the details that you've outlined in the presentation.
Yes, we have an address. Somebody else will have to tell me what it is for people to send in their questions, and they'll help to inform our frequently asked questions or Q&A that will be on the website through the Research Help Centre and through your research office, please. But we really want to receive all your questions, and if they're not answered by the by the slides of the webinar, then we'll do our best to have a clear answer available to you as soon as possible. Thank you.